My name is Thu Anh Nguyen, or Quynh H in Vietnamese. I am a painter, a poet, and an activist. Former and still educator, living in Maryland, not too far outside of Washington, D.C. And to sort of understand my art and my work, I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. And, one of the first things that people ask me when I apply for an artist's grant or a job or when I submit my poetry is a bio. And I think that's really complicated for immigrants and refugees. And so for a long time, I wrote on my bio that I was Vietnamese. And then I met other artists who were like, but aren't you Vietnamese American? And so I'll just start at the beginning of my story, which is that I was born in Saigon, Vietnam. And my father was in the war, and he was imprisoned after the war. And so my family had to leave Vietnam, so I consider us refugees. But our story is even more complex than that, in that my father's sister, my aunt, she married an American soldier. And because she was married to him, we came to the United States in a different way than some refugees came. We were legally sponsored by my aunt and her husband. And so the difficulties that we faced in the United States weren't the same difficulties as others, say a person who came by boat, someone who came illegally, though I don't really love that word. And so when we came to the United States, I was 3.5 and my brother was 2. And my mom tells me that I used to be able to sing songs in Vietnamese because I went to school in Vietnam, and I loved singing songs. And we lived, like many families in Vietnam, in a multi-generational household. My grandmother was the one who slept with me as a baby. So when we left Vietnam, we left that whole family behind. And the only reason that my father was sponsored is because he was the oldest of his 11 siblings. And so part of my journey is very much luck. Not married, it had nothing to do with us. It's just my father's birth order. And so we initially had a hard time settling, like many refugees. We went to California, and that could have been another story, where we grew up around a lot of Vietnamese people and a lot of other refugees and immigrants. But my parents wanted to both find work. So then they went to New Orleans, where my father found work working on fishing boats, crawfish and shrimp. But in Vietnam, he was an engineer. And so it took him a while to get his master's in engineering in the United States, even though he was more than qualified in Vietnam. And so we lived in Louisiana by the grace of some friends who had already moved there, and we lived in their home. And I do remember one of my earliest memories is the Christian missionaries. They donated a lot of my clothing when I was little, and they donated games for my brother and me to play with. And so when I was about 4 or 5, my mother and father both found work in Florida. And so my parents like to say that we moved to Florida because of work and also because of the climate. So Florida's very hot, it is very humid, and it has a very intense wet season, just like Vietnam. So we moved to Florida, and that's where they settled. And that's where I grew up, with a backyard full of Vietnamese produce all the time. We, grew bitter squash and melons and sugar cane. And so it was the only way that my parents really could preserve our Vietnamese culture, because I didn't grow up with any Vietnamese community around me. Eventually, my father, after he became an American citizen and my mom became an American citizen, he sponsored the rest of his siblings to the United States. And so I think that took almost 10 years. And so in middle school and high school, I finally grew up with cousins. But really that was the only Vietnamese community that I had. And My father was an engineer. He had his own business, and my mother was a seamstress. She created ballroom dance gowns. So this very like high form and very specific form of art. I've always thought it was interesting growing up having this mother who was very artistic, but she never considered it art. She considered it as like the way to make a living. And in Vietnam, it was very much like you sew clothes because you have to wear clothes. It was very practical. And so my brother and I are now both artists, and we don't think about the practicality as much, but both of my parents instilled in us this like appreciation for craftsmanship and beauty. And I think my childhood very much like revolved around their appreciation for that. And so the other way that most of my family made a living was owning restaurants in Florida. So they own Chinese restaurants, Chinese buffets, sushi bars, and now my cousin owns a sushi bar that opens for pho on Sundays. And so that to me very much is about like how Asian communities have grown in the United States, and even just in the microcosm of Florida. You know, we started with Chinese buffets because that's what white people wanted to eat. And then sushi became popular, so we own sushi bars. Very like industrious. And it was a way for my parents to keep my brother and I close. When you work in restaurants, you have to go home from school, work in the kitchen. I was a hostess. And so I never got to have sleepovers like other kids did. I didn't like go to dances. I didn't date. So everything was very much like family oriented. And so now I think that, you know, my work is purposely very within a close-knit Vietnamese community because that's how I grew up. And I've always been searching for it, even though once I left Florida, I definitely tried to like flee. So I knew growing up that if I wanted to find other people that weren't white Floridians, that it all depended on me, right? Because I didn't have generational wealth. I didn't have connections in the way that I saw that my, you know, school friends had connections. So very common story. I worked really hard, got scholarships, and, you know, was just a very studious kid. And art was not at all in my world vision of something that was important, because I needed to find the fastest way to make a living and leave Florida and take care of myself, because that's what my parents taught me was most important. And so I was the first person in my family, not just immediate, but like in the larger family, to leave Florida to go to college. And so a lot of my aunts and uncles, you know, asked my parents, like, you know, what are they thinking? Why would they pay for me to leave? Why did I go so far? And my parents were worried about it too, but I went to an all-women's college. And it was there, outside of Boston, that I, for the first time, found a really tight community of first Asians. So like when I moved to campus, the Asian Student Union found me through my last name, and they invited me in. And so same with the VSA, the Vietnamese Student Association. And I got to know Vietnamese students on campus. And then in the Boston area, especially because of Dorchester and Vietnamese communities around there, and all of the colleges, there's a very, very prolific, close-knit, active Vietnamese student group. And so I joined the group that was Harvard and Wellesley and MIT, and the three schools were really close. And so those are still some of my closest friends that I see all the time. And that's also how I met my husband, who is Vietnamese. So, you know, in college, I studied international relations and English. I was going to do the very sort of cliche thing and become a lawyer, and you know, make my parents proud and be very practical. And my junior year in college, my heart was really broken for the first time, and because of that, I started writing all this poetry, and I sent it to an advisor, and he said, you know, he's like, I think you're a poet. And so that was the first time that someone put at the forefront art for me as a possible career path, and as something that I could do, and do really well. And that meant a lot, because I did not have Asian, even, definitely not Vietnamese role models as artists growing up. And so to have an adult tell me that I could do this was really great for me. And so he mentored me. My college thesis was a collection of poetry. And then I still, though, felt all this pressure. And I'll say now that I'm an adult that it wasn't from my parents. My parents always wanted us to be happy and healthy, and really put a lot of faith in our ability to take care of ourselves. I think it was just like osmosis pressure that I felt from the community to be responsible. And so after college, I was about to go to law school. I took my LSATs. I was a paralegal for a year. It was the first year that I moved to Washington, D.C. And I had a great job. I had incredible bosses and mentors. And I still was very miserable. And I looked around and I thought, oh, I'm doing all the things that, you know, my ancestors would have wished. And I am, like, capable of being a very good lawyer. But I thought I was really boring, frankly. And for me, very soul-crushing as a creative person. I looked at a lot of spreadsheets, and it's not my joy at all. And so I just went out on a limb, and I applied to master's programs in creative writing and poetry. And so then I moved back to Boston, and that's what I have my degree in, is poetry specifically. And so there were all these moments in my life where, like, art was calling to me, and I would listen, but only up to a point. Because it's not even just in Asian communities, like in society in general, right? Art isn't a way people make a living. And so even when I went to Boston University and got my master's in poetry, my mentor was, former National Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky, and he is one of the prime examples of making a living from poetry. And he, to me, gave me hope that that was something I could do. And one of the things that school there did was it taught me to become a teacher. And so part of my graduate program was teaching students at Boston University creative writing. And I took to it really easily. I loved it. I loved being in the classroom. I loved talking about writing. And so that's what I did for many years. For about 16 years, I moved to DC. I became a teacher in schools in DC. And that's where I really learned how important my own identity was, because I taught in schools that were mostly white and private schools. And, I would inherit these curriculums that were also very white, very similar to the curriculums I had in schools in Florida. And it took me a couple of years to find my footing and my voice to say, I could teach these books, but I don't want to. And I don't think it's doing a service to my students. For me, I can't be the best teacher I could be, just teaching the same dead white men that, were taught to me. And so I became an expert in curriculum development, diversifying curriculum. That's what I did at both of the private schools that I was at. So I did a lot of curriculum review and rewriting of curriculum. And so my activism really began there. And other schools became interested in my work. And so I traveled a lot to talk about, how do we change canon and change things that are tradition and told to us it is rigorous just because they're white, and make them more to really like speak to the students that who are like me and to give them examples of something else. And so I felt like that was really my job in schools, and I loved it for a long time. And then COVID happened, and all the inequities that I saw in education were multiplied by COVID. All of my students of color were the ones that lived the furthest away, had the least access to technology, had, relatives who lived with them who were immunocompromised. And so the pandemic was really toughest on them. And the schools that I was at didn't understand. And so I had a really hard time squaring away my ethics and my belief systems with what I saw was happening in schools. And something that I've really taken to heart is the idea that, institutions were made to be institutions and to continue to function. And, I'm either working within the institution or I'm leaving. So I decided, I taught one more year after the pandemic, and then I left. And I've been independent ever since. And so what that has meant is that I go to communities as an educator to really talk about justice and equity and social activism at assemblies. I do residencies at schools. I did an art activism residency at Sandy Spring Friends School in the area. I worked with public schools to help diversify their curriculum. I teach educators how to be more aware of the identity of their students. So people ask me all the time if I miss teaching, but I feel like I still do a lot of teaching. And along with that teaching, I have been able to use my artwork. I've always been a creative person in the background, and now I get to bring it more to the forefront. So my latest projects have been doing real intent listening about democracy and belonging, especially with the election coming up. And so I will we call them social sculptures. I go into an environment, and the artwork is the conversation that is happening with people in the room, and hopefully it's a really diverse group of people. The conversation that I was at last week at the De La Cruz Gallery in Georgetown were people who self-identified as being more on the right and people self-identified as being more on the left coming together to have a conversation, not about politics, right, but about art. And so they looked at art, and then they had a discussion about, like, what does that art mean to them? How does it resonate? And through that discussion, sort of like what I'm doing now, they talked about their personal history, how they came here, and then you can sort of like hear about people's politics, but it's mostly about self first. And I think those identities discussions are very meaningful to me. And so as a poet, my job is to hear the phrases that I think resonate the most. I was at a Quaker school for a long time, and something that the Quakers really believe in is listening and getting a sense of what's in the room. And so I do the same thing as a poet. I get a sense for what is bubbling up in the room, and then I compose poetry that reflects that conversation. And so that's mostly my social sculpture work as a poet. And then I also have been engaging with the Vietnamese community in painting. And so I looked, and I think in the last year, I have only worked with other Asian artists and curators, which has really made such a difference in my quality of life and sort of in my ability to show up fully as myself. And so I have a 96-foot long mural right now at the Culture House in Washington, D.C. And that very much to me is representative of who I am. It's called Wildflowers in the DMVN. And so the wildflowers to me represent refugees and immigrants. Wildflowers being seeds that have flown far and landed and still manage to flourish and bloom and be beautiful. And the DMVN stands for like where I am now in DC, Maryland, Virginia, and also the N for Vietnam. So the mural is of ragwort and swamp mallow and Virginia bluebells, all flowers from this area, and then the red phoenix flower from Vietnam. And so it's a melding of all the different parts of who I am. And that to me is like a visual representation. And so I'm only trying, and I've been successful so far, but we'll see, to take jobs where I get to show up as my full self and make artwork that is meaningfully universal, but also meaningful personally to me. And so I have found it really helpful to, say yes mostly to other Asian activists and artists. And through that, I haven't had to really look for work because the community is so circular and supportive, and they've really scaffolded all the work that I do. And one thing will lead to another person, introducing me to another person, and that's how I have managed to really, if we go back to the beginning of what I was saying before about what you write on your bio, it's really how I've been able to claim, being Vietnamese. And not just American, because I think it's more specific than that for me. I'm Vietnamese-Floridian because to me that tells the story of my parents' decision to be at a certain place in America, and also like my growth in a community that was very much not for me. And so what it has meant to me to find my own community and be in a place where I feel is for me. And so that's how I describe myself now. So, in talking about being Vietnamese or a Vietnamese American or Vietnamese Floridian, even just saying that is, categorization. And a lot of my work, especially my social justice work, is about like very specific identity work, so that, we're not talking about all Asians as a monolith or all Asian Americans. And so I don't often describe myself as Asian or Asian American because I want it specifically to be Vietnamese, especially in the context of living in the United States and coming from the war in Vietnam. I think it's important to differentiate. And the same goes for my friends who are Taiwanese, who identify as Taiwanese. I can have so much in common with them. And also, there are distinct parts of our history with wars and colonialism that are important and tell a story about who we are and who, we might relate to and how we got here. And so I think that's important to know, especially as my children are growing up in schools and they're asked to identify themselves. And, I remember growing up in Florida, a white boy asked me, what are you, Chinese? And I was in middle school and I knew it was important for me to say no. And he's like, are you Japanese? And I said, no. And he said, well, what are you? And I said, I'm Vietnamese. And he said, that's not a country, that's a war. And that was really my first lesson in sort of like limited views of what it means to be Asian in America. That most people will ask if I'm Chinese first. And then maybe nowadays, especially where we live, they'll ask if I'm Korean. And even within the Vietnamese community, because my English is so good, and I think something about my facial structure, my coloring, some Vietnamese people question how Vietnamese I am. And so, you know, I think it's important for me to claim that identity. I don't ask others to, but my kids are so different. They're very proudly, I went to a parent conference, tell their teachers, like, I'm Vietnamese. My mom's Vietnamese and my dad's Vietnamese. And so I feel so hopeful that that is something that they are not shy about, that no one's questioning, that is something that brings them a lot of joy. But I'm also very aware of the fact that they're Vietnamese boys, and it is quite different, the intersectionality of my Vietnamese identity and my female identity. I think, you know, in thinking about the future of this community, there is a lot of generational beliefs and trauma to unpack. And I think for me, being a woman in a male-dominated society, and also an Asian woman, a Vietnamese woman, who grew up with a lot of talk and you know, sort of belief systems around like what a good wife is or what a good mother is. It's important for me, for my sons and like future generations, to see someone who works as something that they love. Because my mother was not always happy in her work, but it was something that she had to do. And I think a part of my job is to take the freedom that I've been given by my parents, by the fact that they work so hard, and, you know, set this example for the future, that, you know, you can also do meaningful work that makes you happy, that gives back to your community, and that it isn't always just about surviving, and it isn't always just about capitalism, even though very much it is. You do have to survive. But those weren't things that were told to me or shown to me. It was very much like we work very, very hard. And, you know, my mother was always around and gave up a lot of her happiness and her time. And, you know, meals were always ready for me when I got home. And I saw a lot of unhappiness growing up. It wasn't like a role that she cherished, but very much felt like it was something that she had to do. And so I think about that a lot in the stories that we tell our kids and our students and future generations about, you know, what is the path for a Vietnamese or Asian woman versus a Vietnamese or Asian man. And I think a lot about like what it means to show them something that is more equitable in, you know, in work, in work-life balance. It's one of the reasons that I love being self-employed now and not working for someone else all the time. And I don't think that was an example that was given to me. It was always much a box of like, you go work for like a company, or a law firm or a doctor's office. You do things that are very safe. And I know where that comes from. And I very much like feel indebted to the hard work that my generations before me put in, so that I could have this like freedom of choice. And so when my mother was here visiting recently, I had just completed a job with a restaurant in Falls Church called New Elegantly Vietnamese, owned by a young Vietnamese woman entrepreneur, Thu Anh Nguyen, and Duy Nhi is one of my favorite people to work with because she has purposely gone out in search of Vietnamese artists. And when she found me, you know, she said, I really want to partner with you, and I want it to be about your artwork and you being Vietnamese. And so together we created a summer menu of Vietnamese fruits. And it was a real partnership because I painted the Vietnamese fruits that go on the menu, and then we told stories. And I think that is the most important part of my work, is whether through painting or through poetry, I'm telling stories about what it means to be a Vietnamese person. And we hosted this dinner together where we invited the Vietnamese community from Maryland, Virginia, DC, and I asked people to tell stories about fruit in their lives. And really those stories were always about care and caring. You know, at the end of a meal, you get served, mostly by a woman, peeled fruit, cut fruit. And it's a way to show love and care, and it's heritage work. And I think part of my job, social justice-wise, is to name that it's labor. It's really important labor that we do for the community. And so we elevated this labor to this art form at the dinner, and I heard stories from other people who talked about, one person came to me in tears and said, you know, I haven't had someone cut fruit for me since I left home. And so, you know, I think about that. I think about my own kids leaving and going to college or not, or doing whatever they need to do in their lives. And, you know, will I cut fruit for them forever? Or do I always cut fruit for them? Do I teach them how to cut their own fruit? It's part of the reason they go to a Montessori school, because they have to cut their own fruit and take care of themselves. And so all the ways in which we are retelling the stories that we've been told our whole lives, and also changing them, right? Making that narrative different. And so that project with New Elegantly Vietnamese was really beautiful to me. And my mom was visiting, and I was going to visit the restaurant, and Duy Nhi wrote a check for me for my work, and she handed it to me. And the first thing my mom did was she took the check out of my hand, and she looked at it, and she goes, oh. And you could tell she was just surprised and impressed that I got paid for this work. Because to her, maybe, it just seems that I'm painting and it's not work. And so part of my job as an artist is to really talk about the work of it, the labor of it, and that it is, you know, a job like any other job. If I was a lawyer, that would still count as work, and I would get paid, and I would, you know, to have respect for the work that I do, which I think makes her feel good, because my mom wasn't always respected for the work that she did, right? And what does it mean for her to be this older generation looking at me doing work as well in the community? And what does it mean that she gets to see me do work with all these other Vietnamese people where I live? And so, you know, I've also worked on the Vagabond zine with artists. I think there's 13 of us, Vietnamese artists, in DC, in New York, one who's located in Vietnam, actually. And part of that zine was to tell stories of, well, not just to tell stories, but to write letters to our younger selves. And so, you know, that really allowed me to both use my painting and my writing to talk to my younger self about, you know, what my hopes are. And, you know, my letter to myself was really about, you know, understanding that, you know, no matter what I did, I could be proud of myself, and that I could love myself and my work. And I think that isn't something that was necessarily told to me when I was younger. It was all about making enough money for a house. And I think it's taken, my parents, they've always been proud of us, but it's taken them a while to understand that we'll be okay. There's a lot of, not just generational trauma, but like because of that trauma, this feeling of like insecurity that, when are we really going to feel like we've made it? My brother is also an artist, and he is a jazz pianist, and he's a filmmaker. And so to have these two Vietnamese artist children is probably very strange and disconcerting to my family. But I think it is a function of how supportive they were, that we both had the confidence enough to do that for our lives. And even as we're doing our art, it is so much about the way that we grew up. So my brother's graphic novels are about growing up the only Vietnamese kids in Florida. And it's called The Gulf because we lived on the Gulf of Mexico, but also Vietnam is surrounded by water. And if you look at like the shape of Florida and the shape of Vietnam and all the water, it's like our stories, although transplanted from Vietnam to Florida, like echo each other so much. And so, to have in my life someone who is, I consider one of my closest friends, my brother, doing similar work to me, and to feel very supported by him, and I go to all his shows and he comes to mine, gives me a lot of hope for like the children that we're raising and the children that we're teaching. He's a professor at Loyola University, and so it makes me feel incredible that his students get to see a Vietnamese filmmaker and like artist, teaching them about how to see the world, and how their stories really matter to the world, in the same way that he, writes stories that are, about us and the way that we grew up. And I think that is why, it's important to have something of your own and to be secure in your identity and all the different facets of it, because that's really how you make work that is meaningful to you. And I hope that it's impactful to others, but I'm less interested in that as I get older. I hope that I am more of a mirror to people than I am a window. I don't want, I'm very cognizant of being in spaces where I'm constantly this window that people get to be a voyeur and just like look at my experience. Which is why I try to work in Asian communities so often, is that I prefer to be a mirror so that other people are seeing something that reflects something that they've been through or are, going through, and that we can engage in a more like even relationship, like equitable relationship, than just constantly, me giving. And that is something that has become really significant to me in my work as well. And so, I'm doing all this work, this political work, with my social justice work, and especially with the election coming up, it's become very important to me to be more vocal, although sometimes I'm worried. I'm like, what is my mom going to think about this? Because, growing up in Florida especially, surrounded by a lot of Republicans, and not just Republicans, like not fiscal Republicans, like very right-wing, very Trump signs everywhere, very, Brandon all over the place, is to me not just a matter of like differing views, but it reminds me of like the racism that I grew up with, feeling like an outsider. And so as much as possible, I feel like I have to use the privilege that I have and the voice that I have to say that, I am Vietnamese, but I am far left. And that, I'm raising these boys who my oldest son just described himself to me because he was talking about how girls tell him about everything. And he said, well, it's because I'm a gender transcender. I'm hopefully raising people who are like interested in others and empathetic and caring and like respectful of other people's rights, which is what is most important to me, which is what I don't see in conversations coming from, you know, some people that I really care about, some family who vote Trump, who have told me it's about, for them, like holding on to the wealth that they've attained. And that is, you know, so not my worldview. And also, these are people that are related to me, right? And that I care about. And so, how do I, you know, love my family and check in on them and stay close to them? And also say that, you know, I don't believe in hoarding wealth or in, you know, kicking immigrants out. You know, I do believe in like women's rights and reproduction and choice. And even if those things weren't the things that I was told growing up, I still want to be close to the people who, you know, believe differing things than I do. And so there's this like real tension there. And I, you know, try to talk to my kids and students about, you know, what it means to live in this world where we still should interact with people who believe different things than we do. You know, we can joke about it, and we can, you know, call people names that, you know, we see on the news all the time, but that doesn't get us anywhere. And still, at the end of the day, we're going to be having meals with these people, right? I am with my family for holidays, for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, and so, you know, what does it mean to be with family who, you know, have reacted to very difficult situations with different belief systems than you, right? And to me that goes back to like, how do we engage in these conversations about like who we are, and, you know, the care that we have for each other, because even a Trumper aunt will still make me, you know, pho or, you know, my favorite things. She'll still, like, you know, save me mangao. Like, there is love there. And also there are, like, really hard conversations that have to be had. But not giving up on those conversations. And where I can choose, I do choose to not, you know, engage with people who I feel like might harm me, or, you know, aren't willing to listen at all. There is like a line that I can draw, but I think anyone who knows me and like sees my work knows what I believe in. I'm very like open and public about it. And so, you know, when I'm painting posters about, you know, the right to an abortion, or, you know, trans rights, I'm not private about it, so it's everywhere. That's what being an artist in the public sphere is. And so, in a way, my community has broadened because more people see that artwork, but it's also gotten smaller in the sense that, like, maybe folks who don't agree with me don't engage with me, and that's really okay by me as well.